Well, tonight, the President of the United States said he would break the law to win re-election. That is the essential headline of the night. The President of the United States is willing to violate the law to win his re-election. And in an interview with ABC's George Stephanopoulos, President Trump was asked if a foreign government offers him information on his opponent, will he accept that help from a foreign government or a foreign national? Will he call the FBI? President Trump said, "You don't call the FBI." Those were his exact words. "You don't call the FBI." That's what he said. He also said, "I think I'd want to hear it." Those were his exact words. "I'd want to hear it," meaning he'd want to hear exactly what the foreign national or foreign government was actually illegally offering him. Here's what federal law says about this. It says, it shall be unlawful for a foreign national directly or indirectly to make a contribution or donation of money or, this is the important part, other thing of value, or to make an express or implied promise to make a contribution or donation in connection with a federal, state, or local election. That law also says it shall be unlawful for a person to solicit, and here's the president's role in this, accept, that word accept, solicit or accept or receive a contribution or donation from a foreign national. The president said he would accept it. The law does regard opposition research as a thing of value for a political campaign. But in his interview with George Stephanopoulos, the president showed no evidence that he has any understanding of the law that he seems to be willing to violate. George Stephanopoulos began his sequence of questions by asking Donald Trump about Donald Trump Jr.'s appearance once again today in a closed-door session of the Senate Intelligence Committee.
Your son, Don Jr., is up before the Senate Intelligence Committee today. And again, he was not charged with anything. In retrospect, though,
by the way, not only wasn't he charged, if you read it, with all of the horrible fake news, I mean, I was reading that my son was going to go to jail. This is a good young man, that he was going to go to jail.
In June of 2016, just months before the election, Don Jr. received an email from a business associate promising dirt on Hillary Clinton from the Russian government. Don Jr.'s response, "If it's what you say, I love it." The conversation led to a meeting in Trump Tower that included the president's son, his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and a Russian lawyer. Don Jr. insists nothing came of it. And special counsel Robert Mueller concluded there was not enough evidence to charge a conspiracy between the Trump campaign and Russia.
And then the report comes out, and they didn't even say, they hardly even talked about it.
Should he have gone to the FBI when he got that email?
Okay, let's put yourself in a position. You're a congressman. Somebody comes up and says, "Hey, I have information on your opponent." Do you call the FBI? I don't think.
Coming from
I'll tell you
Russia,
what,
you do?
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life, you don't call the FBI. You throw somebody out of your office. You do whatever.
Al Gore got a stolen briefing book. He called the FBI.
Well, that's different. A stolen briefing book. This isn't a stolen. This is somebody that said, "We have information on your opponent." Oh, let me call the FBI. Give me a break. Life doesn't work that way.
The FBI director says that's what should happen.
The FBI director is wrong.
Your campaign this time around, if foreigners, if Russia, if China, if someone else offers you information on an opponent, should they accept it or should they call the FBI?
I think maybe you do both. I think you might want to listen. There's nothing wrong with listening. If somebody called from a country, Norway, "We have information on your opponent." Oh, I think I'd want to hear it.
Do you want that kind of interference in our elections?
It's not an interference. They have information. I think I'd take it. If I thought there was something wrong, I'd go maybe to the FBI if I thought there was something wrong. But when somebody comes up with Oppo research, right, they come up with Oppo research. Oh, let's call the FBI. The FBI doesn't have enough agents to take care of it. But you go and talk honestly to congressmen. They all do it. They always have. And that's the way it is. It's called Oppo research.
Here's what FBI Director Christopher Wray said about that last month.
I think my view is that if any public official or member of any campaign is contacted by any nation state or anybody acting on behalf of a nation state about influencing or interfering with our election, then that's something that the FBI would want to know about.
Leading off our discussion tonight, Chuck Rosenberg, former senior FBI official and former U.S. attorney. He was also former counsel to Robert Mueller at the FBI and now hosts the MSNBC podcast, The Oath. Also with us, Frank Figliuzzi, a former FBI assistant director for Counterintelligence. And Rick Stengel is with us. He's a former undersecretary of state in the Obama administration. All three are MSNBC analysts. And Chuck Rosenberg, let me start with you. President Trump said tonight, if they have information, I think I'd take it. At that point, he was referring to Norway. Is it okay to take the information if it comes from Norway?
It is not okay to take it from Norway, from Ireland, from Canada, from Russia, from China. Name a foreign country, Lawrence, it's not okay. And by the way, this is not really a close call. You know, in the universe in which we live, in the real universe, there are bad ideas and then there are incredibly bad ideas. And an incredibly bad idea is to take information from a foreign national. Federal law prohibits it, and I'm sure Frank Figliuzzi will tell you it's also a really bad idea because it is the start, it is the beginning of a foreign influence operation. And so one thing we can be sure of, Mr. Trump did not read the Mueller report. In fact, in the Mueller report, they spend a lot of pages and a whole bunch of ink discussing why this is not okay. Now, in the end, in the Mueller report, they say we may not be able to charge the Trump Tower offer of information under federal criminal law, but nowhere do they say it's okay. It's not okay, Lawrence.
And here's the president saying he would accept it. And I just read the law that makes accepting it illegal, as well as it's illegal for the foreign national to offer it. I want to isolate something in particular the president said, and this is President of the United States as mob boss talking about his own personal notion of when you call the FBI and why he in his entire life has never called the FBI. And let's all remember, this is somebody who operated casinos in Atlantic City. This is someone in the commercial real estate business in New York City, where the FBI has actually had a lot of investigative leads over the years. Let's listen to the president talking about why you don't ever call the FBI.
I've seen a lot of things over my life. I don't think in my whole life I've ever called the FBI. In my whole life, you don't call the FBI.
Frank Figliuzzi, what does that sound like to you?
Sounds like a capo in La Cosa Nostra saying we take care of things in this thing of ours. We don't get anybody from outside involved. We don't talk to the feds. That's what it sounds like to me. Lawrence, I want to focus on something the president said, which is it's okay to listen. It's okay to listen if you're offered some as he calls it, research oppo from a foreign nation. Here's what's wrong with that notion from a counterintelligence perspective. The moment you agree to sit down and listen, the moment they agreed to sit down at that Trump Tower meeting and listen to dirt being offered on Hillary Clinton, they are owned by that foreign power. That is the recruitment operation. You don't have to accept it. You don't have to receive it. Yes, you just cited the law, and those are statutory elements for a crime. But on the counterintelligence side, the second you sit down and agree to do something shady, they own you. And I'm more convinced than ever over what we've heard from the president over the last 24 hours regarding CIA not being able, or he wouldn't allow CIA to recruit the half-brother of Kim Jong-un. He doesn't believe anything's wrong with taking oppo research up to and including the next election. I'm more than convinced than ever that this president may well be owned or will soon be owned by the time the 2020 election is over.
Rick Stengel, you're the only one among us who has worked in a presidential campaign. You worked on the campaign that came in second for the Democratic nomination in 2000, Senator Bill Bradley. You're working on that campaign. You get a call from a Russian or from someone in Norway or North Korea, some source saying, we have some information on Al Gore, we have some information on your opponent. What do you do?
Well, you know, the expression call the FBI is a bit of a misnomer. What you would do is you would take that to the head of the campaign and say, I got this solicitation, I got this call. You would then call the Federal Election Commission. There is a whole range of activities that pretty much anybody in a domestic American campaign knows that you can't do that kind of thing. So you would certainly alert the other people in the campaign to it, and then you would call the Federal Election Commission.
The president tonight is saying everyone does it. He's saying every member of Congress would do it, which means every Republican member of Congress must now tell us how many times they have done this.
Well, that would be good to know. I mean, what he doesn't seem to understand is that the law is meant to restrain some impulses that we have. His impulses is that he would do anything. He would talk to the devil in order to defeat his opponent, which also wouldn't be legal. And by the way, the only time he didn't even call the FBI when he fired the head of the FBI.
Yeah, well, Chuck Rosenberg, the one time he did call the FBI is when he wanted the FBI to go easy on Mike Flynn.
Yeah, you know, I recall that. The other thing I recall the president saying, Lawrence, which is also a really odd thing for a president to say, is that remember when he said he's been around flippers his entire life? He knows flippers. He knows what they're like, referring to cooperating witnesses with that slang term. I mean, who's around flippers? Back to Frank's point, people who are around flippers their entire life, people who never call the FBI, tend to be criminals. That's who they hang out with. That's who they know. That's their currency. And so it's really not all that surprising. It's incredibly disappointing. But it's not all that surprising because it's really more of the same.
Frank, it is very difficult to imagine anything that we talk about in Trump world happening in a previous presidency. But imagine, if you will, during your time of service in the FBI, that the President of the United States, on a very simple black and white letter of the law matter, simply said publicly, emphatically, the FBI director is wrong. What would the FBI director do in any other world other than Trump world?
Well, if we had normalcy, we'd have the director offer to sit down in the Oval Office and explain the law and the counterintelligence mission of the Bureau, but we don't live in normalcy. We might even have an FBI director come out and say, I want you to understand, public and Congress, everyone needs to know we're on the same page here. You call us, and here's why. But we don't live in normalcy. So what's going to happen? Likely nothing. Why? Because of fear that the attack on the institution of the FBI has now reached the point of a personal attack on Trump's own handpicked director. The Republican director of the FBI that Trump picked is now being personally attacked. We've hit the end of the spectrum in terms of attack on the institution, and it's about time that the public stood up and said, that's enough. That's enough of attacking people who are simply trying to protect the country.
Chuck Rosenberg, you were once counsel to the director of the FBI, who was then Robert Mueller. You're at home, you're watching TV, you watch the President of the United States say the FBI director is wrong. You pick up the phone, you call the FBI director and advise him to do what?
Wow, tough question. I think in this case, Chris Wray has said everything he needs to say. He just happened to have said it a month ago. I mean, it's awfully tempting to come out every time the president says something that's wrong and rebut him. But then Chris Wray would be doing nothing else in his job other than rebutting the president. The law is clear. The director of the FBI was clear when he testified before Congress about the law. The men and women in law enforcement and the intelligence community know what's required. Rick Stengel explained to us that people who work in serious campaigns know what's required. I'm not sure I would tell Chris Wray that he needed to say something else, and I don't expect that he will. He was perfectly clear.
Chuck, what about the Attorney General?
Well, right. So the Attorney General is in a different and a more political position. I would hope at the very least, to Frank's point, that the Attorney General would sit down with the President and say, Mr. President, if this is your understanding of the law, then your understanding is flat out wrong. I don't know that he will, but somebody ought to advise the President, because if others are taking advice from the President on this point, they're also going to find themselves in trouble.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.